sections of the Births and Deaths Registration Act have been declared unconstitutional for failing to provide bereaved parents the option to bury their fetal remains of a pregnancy loss that occurred earlier than 26 weeks and irrespective of the manner of loss. Now, this came to light after a recent court ruling. Joining us now for details on what changes and relief this will bring to families is Women's Legal Center Director Seeham Samaai and Sexual and Reproductive Justice Policy Analyst, that's Marion Stevens. Marion, I'll start with you. Now, certain sections of the Births and Deaths Registration Act have been found to be unconstitutional for failing to provide bereaved parents the option to bury the fetal remains of a pregnancy loss that occurred earlier than 26 weeks. Just take us through the legal implication of this ruling.
So we joined as the Sexual and Reproductive Justice Coalition with regard to, as an amicus, as a friend of the court, with regard to the implications for women, that this might be an undue burden for them in accessing services. And we were particularly concerned because most pregnancy loss actually happens it happens actually in 1 in 3 women within the first trimester. And we were concerned about the implications for this for women having a spontaneous miscarriage or an abortion and the undue burden that that would have in accessing health services. So that is why we joined as a friend of the court, and knowing that abortion services in particular are restricted and that many women do not feel welcome in services, we were concerned that this additional request on the registration of and fetal burial would be a limitation to women.
Samaai, let's bring you into the conversation. Why is it important to understand the legal implication of this ruling, and what does it mean for women? Well, let's go back to Marion now. Marion, there was also the primary argument that the option to bury in abortion services would invariably impact women's ability to seek and access these services without fear, stigma, or even prejudice and marginalization. Let's speak to this aspect of the ruling.
Sorry, I think Seeham's microphone's on now. Do you want to repeat the question? Yes.
Yes, thank you. Apologies for that. Just from the Women's Legal Center side, I mean, we also joined as amicus curiae in this particular matter. And the Women's Legal Center is an African feminist legal center which advances the rights of women. And one of our focal areas is the advancement of sexual health and reproductive rights. And it's for us to be able to ensure that the rights of women as well as the rights that have been developed over the past few years are safeguarded in relation to safe abortions. And so this particular case, although the organization which Marion also represented and WLC, we abided by the decision because the issue for us was to ensure that the rights are not taken back in relation to just in terms of the abortion laws. And so the option to bury in abortion services would invariably impact on the ability for women to seek and access services. And it was very important for us to be able to place before the court the specific circumstances of women facing those abortions, because we all know that stereotype, we do know that culture, we all know sadly also that religion, etc., all impact on women's access to safe abortion. And so even though the court has indicated, the court specifically indicated that this particular provision, although it impacts on grieving parents, and that provision was unconstitutional to the extent that it does not provide for their rights, it does not impact on the rights of women that have accessed abortion. And I think it's very important. It might be a very technical case, and Marion would know, but the issue, and we need to be able to speak about the issue of viability, because many times after 6 months, we need to be able to deal with the issue of viability, which means that the fetus, Marion can also speak about that particular issue, but the court specifically indicated that this particular case did not deal with the issue of viability. It dealt with the rights of grieving parents, and we need to be able to understand that, because once we start derogating that particular right around or start looking at viability, it starts really impacting on the right of women and their right to bodily autonomy and their right to abortion services. So our purpose within this was to place feminist arguments before the court and to specifically deal with the gendered implications of this particular provisions of the Birth and Registration Act, and that which was declared unconstitutional, and how it could impact on the rights of women who wanted an abortion. So this particular application set a particular legal standard, but it is very important that those legal standards and concepts do not disadvantage women at the end of the day, and that was our purpose. And to be able to place before the court and ask the question, how does this particular position and policy and declaration impact on the rights of women at the end of the day who want to access? Because we need to, and the fact is, we need to deal with the issue of gender bias. It is a reality for many women in our country who at the end of the day cannot access safe abortion services because of the various barriers. I think Marion will be able to speak more about those particular barriers, but it's important that we were there to be able to bring a consciousness to the court of the circumstances which face women that want abortion.
Marion, let's bring you back into the conversation. There was also a primary argument that the option to bury in abortion services would invariably impact on women's ability to seek and even access these services without fear, stigma, prejudice, and even marginalization. Now, this hinges on the argument that the inclusion and implementation of the option to bury in the current circumstances of the service provision would effectively amount to a barrier to access. Please explain this aspect further for us.
Right. So just to contextualize this actually happened in 2018, right in the middle of the Trump administration. And to give you a global context, this is what happens to many women in the southern states of America. And it is actually a strategy used by the evangelical Christian right to limit women's access to abortion. So it happens in states like Texas and Arkansas and Tennessee, and what is happening in those services is the cost of bearing the fetus is given to the woman, and this is then seen as a barrier. So so I am coming in with a pregnancy loss for whatever reason, whether it's elective or not, and now I'm having to, if I'm choosing to have an abortion, I'm having to take that cost and then also deal with it, as opposed to letting myself deal with it in my own way and manner and how I'm accustomed to doing that, or in my time. And so if you can imagine that imported into South Africa, and what that would mean for women who are struggling to access the health services. So we already have only about 40% of our abortion facilities operational, and that has decreased in our COVID times. And we have learned that in the first wave of COVID, our maternal mortality rate increased by 30%, meaning that women are dying around the time of pregnancy, 6 weeks before or afterwards, and some of that due to abortion and possibly being scared of coming into the health services for a range of reasons. And so one of the important things to remember as well is that I know for you folks in the media, you might be aware of it, is that the most common media story around abortion is actually concealment of births. So women not accessing abortion have to find a way to safely dispose of the contents of their pregnancy that they might have procured illegally. And so then, many women disadvantaged and this is also a land issue, let's say. So women not having access to a piece of land, privacy, and having the safety and privacy of being able to dispose in their own way of how that might happen. And I think it's really important also to remember, I always remember from a long time ago, almost, over 20 years ago in Parliament, listening to Master Sulu talk about our abortion legislation and say that this is a dignified opportunity for women to make sense of their pregnancy loss and not to have to deal with methods that are not very nice. Yeah. And how appropriate it would be to have women being provided with a health service that essentially was only available to middle-class women and white women previously. And with the liberalization of the law, we have made that opportunity available to all women. So I hope that gives you a couple of signposts for how this is actually a barrier for women.
Right. That's Marion Stevens there, as well as Seeham Samaai, speaking to us about a very important issue there when it comes to women in South Africa continuing to face serious barriers in access to safe and legal abortion services.